James Darby was the forgotten son, erased from family photos and buried in silence. Marla Voss was the disgraced nurse with a taste for revenge. Together, they turned the Darby family home into a house of horrors, where every room held a body, and every secret screamed. What seemed like a senseless massacre was, in truth, a meticulously crafted plan years in the making. This is the chilling story of the Darby family massacre, a case so disturbing it made hardened detectives break down in tears. In the quiet town of Willard, Oregon, Lilac Street was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Rows of modest houses with tidy lawns and American flags gently swaying in the breeze gave the neighborhood a sense of safety. Children rode bikes after school, neighbors waved from driveways, and life moved at a comfortable, uneventful pace. At the far end of the street sat the Darby family home, a pale blue two-story house with a white porch and thick hedges that created a sort of barrier from the world. People didn't think much about the Darbys. They were polite, quiet, and private, the kind of family that kept to themselves. Walter Darby worked in town as a mechanic. He was known to be skilled with engines and didn't talk much beyond what was needed for the job. Emily Darby, his wife, stayed at home and was occasionally seen shopping at the local grocery store or picking the kids up from school. Their children, Clara, Nathan, and June, were enrolled in public school and seemed ordinary enough. Clara, the oldest, was said to be bright but distant. Nathan liked video games and rarely socialized. June, the youngest, was often seen clutching a stuffed rabbit as she walked down the sidewalk beside her mother. To the outside world, there was nothing alarming about the Darby family. They were just another household trying to live a quiet life. What struck people most was how little anyone really knew them. They never hosted parties, didn't attend local church gatherings, and didn't seem to make friends in the community. The curtains at their house were always drawn, even in the middle of the day. No music, no shouting, no laughter ever escaped the walls of their home. Many assumed they just valued their privacy. On the morning of February 14, 2019, the town woke up to a cold but sunny winter day. Nothing seemed out of place, until a local mail carrier noticed that the Darby's mailbox was full to the brim. Several newspapers were stacked on the front, step untouched. The front porch light, usually off during the day, was still on. It had been on for days, he realized. Something felt wrong. The mail carrier contacted the sheriff's department and requested a wellness check. Officers arrived later that afternoon. When they knocked, there was no answer. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was silent, unnaturally so. What the deputies found was beyond anything they'd ever seen. Each member of the Darby family was dead, not together in one room, but separated, killed in different parts of the house. It wasn't just the brutality that shocked the officers. It was the eerie stillness, the unnatural order. Nothing had been stolen. There was no forced entry. The house was spotless. Those first responders would later say that something about the house didn't feel right, as if it had absorbed the violence it had witnessed. One detective reportedly walked out mid-search and sat on the curb, visibly shaken. Another was seen, wiping away tears. The Darby family, once a quiet fixture in the background of the neighborhood, had become the center of one of the most horrifying crimes Willard had ever seen. Detectives began their investigation with a list of questions that had no immediate answers. The most pressing one was how an entire family could be murdered without anyone in the neighborhood seeing or hearing anything. The Darby house wasn't isolated. It had neighbors on both sides, a streetlight out front, and was less than a mile from the town's police station. Yet somehow the killer had entered and exited without leaving a single trace, or so it seemed. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Nothing was stolen. Wallets, purses, and phones were still inside the house. Valuable items, jewelry, electronics, cash remained untouched. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Instead, the house seemed preserved, almost staged, except for the bodies. Each victim had been killed in a different manner. Walter Darby was found in the garage, bludgeoned with a heavy tool, possibly a wrench. Emily's body was discovered in the bedroom, signs of manual strangulation evident on her neck. Clara lay lifeless in the upstairs bathroom, her lips blue, later confirmed to be the result of poisoning. Nathan had deep cuts across his chest and arms, likely inflicted with a knife found in the kitchen. June, the youngest, was in her bed, appearing peaceful until the autopsy revealed she had been smothered. The variety in the methods puzzled investigators. It didn't feel random, but it didn't follow any familiar pattern either. Serial killers, when they strike, often use the same method. Crimes of passion tend to be chaotic, not methodical. But this was organized, deliberate. It suggested that the killer knew the family, knew the house, and perhaps even planned. The entire thing over a long period of time. Fingerprints were collected from every surface, but none belonged to anyone outside the family. The only DNA found in the house matched members of the Darby household. The front door had no damage, no scratch marks. Investigators considered the possibility that the killer had a key or was let inside. But who would the family trust enough to allow in without suspicion? Neighbors were interviewed. No one heard screams, shouts, or breaking glass. The Darby house had thick insulation and tightly sealed windows. Some residents remembered seeing lights on late at night over the past few days, but thought nothing of it. One neighbor recalled seeing Walter's truck parked at an odd angle the day before. The bodies were discovered, but she hadn't thought to report it. Another mentioned that the family's dog hadn't been seen lately, only for officers to find it locked in the backyard shed, unharmed but shaken. Surveillance footage from surrounding homes was reviewed, but there were no clear images of anyone approaching or leaving the Darby house during the likely time frame of the murders. The Darby home itself had no security cameras, no signs of a break-in, no evidence of an escape. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air after committing a series of perfectly timed, calculated murders. And beneath it all was the growing sense that this wasn't just a crime, it was a message, a deeply personal one. But who had sent it and why remained a complete mystery. The investigation took a new turn when detectives began digging into the Darby family's background. They combed through old medical records, school files, and family documents. That's when they found something that hadn't been mentioned by any neighbors, school officials, or even extended family. Walter and Emily Darby once had a fourth child. His name was James Darby. James had been removed from school at the age of 14 following a violent incident in which he attacked a classmate with a pair of scissors during lunch. The attack was sudden and unprovoked. The victim survived, but James was arrested and sent to a juvenile psychiatric facility for mandatory treatment. After that, he disappeared from all public records. The Darbys never spoke of him again. There were no photos of James in the house, not even in family albums. It was as if he had been erased. According to documents, James was released from the facility when he turned 18 and had no further contact with his family. The court had granted him early independence, and he disappeared into the world without so much as a note. The facility's records described him as emotionally flat, highly intelligent, and prone to obsessive thinking. Despite his past, he had no criminal record as an adult. He had managed to stay under the radar for years. Detectives located James living in a small town nearly 300 miles away. He was employed at a gas station, worked the night shift, and rented a rundown apartment above a liquor store. When police visited him, he didn't seem surprised to see them. He was calm, quiet, and showed no visible reaction when told about the deaths of his parents and siblings. He claimed he hadn't spoken to them in over 6 years and had no involvement in what happened. His alibi was solid, confirmed by his employer and backed by surveillance footage showing him at work during the estimated time of the murders. Still, something about James felt off. He was too still, too unbothered. While others who knew the Darbys were visibly shaken by the news, James didn't flinch. Investigators obtained a warrant to search his apartment, and what they found added another chilling layer to the case. Hidden in a drawer beneath his bed was a thick, spiral-bound notebook. Inside were pages filled with drawings, some crude, others disturbingly detailed. Most showed the Darby house drawn from multiple angles. One page had the layout of the living room, complete with labels for where each piece of furniture was placed. Another showed the upstairs hallway. Then came sketches labeled with the names of his family members. Each one depicted a violent scene. Walter lying in the garage, Clara slumped beside a bathtub, June tucked into bed with a shadowy figure standing over her. The images matched the crime scene photos exactly, down to the positions of the bodies. But no physical evidence linked James to the house. His fingerprints were nowhere to be found, and he had what seemed like an airtight alibi. The notebook raised more questions than answers. Was it a product of obsession or a blueprint for something he had somehow orchestrated from a distance? Detectives were no longer sure who or what they were dealing with, though, despite the disturbing contents of James Darby's notebook, investigators were stuck. His alibi placed him over 300 miles away at the time of the murders, and no evidence placed him at the Darby home. Still, detectives couldn't shake the feeling that he was involved. They decided to re-examine the crime scene in the hopes that something had been missed. The house had already been processed, photographed, and cleared, but there was a growing belief that there might be more hidden beneath the surface, literally. During a second walk-through of the Darby home, a technician inspecting the basement noticed a faint draft coming from the far wall. He tapped along the surface and heard a hollow sound. What looked like an ordinary panel was hiding something. With permission, the team carefully removed a section of drywall, revealing a narrow makeshift crawl space. It was just large enough for someone to crawl through. Inside, they found a thin mattress, an empty water bottle, wrappers from protein bars, a flashlight, and a small blanket. Everything smelled of mildew and stale air. The discovery was shocking. Someone had been living inside the walls of the Darby house. DNA samples were taken from the items inside the crawl space and rushed to the lab. Within days, results came back. The DNA matched James Darby. Investigators were stunned. Somehow James had managed to secretly return to his childhood home and live inside its walls, completely unnoticed for weeks. The hidden entrance to the crawlspace was located behind a disused storm door on the side of the house, covered in overgrown shrubs. It was rarely opened and led into a part of the basement that had fallen into disuse. It made sense how James could have slipped in without detection. He had likely used his knowledge of the house's layout, memorized from childhood, to plan everything. And based on food wrappers and expiration dates, he had been there for at least 3 weeks before the murders took place. Now, the evidence was starting to make sense. James didn't need to break into the house. He had been living there, watching, studying, waiting. Investigators theorized that he had observed the family's routines, understood when they would be most vulnerable, and killed each member at a time when they were isolated from the others. But there was one problem. Security footage from James's workplace showed him present on the nights in question. His supervisor confirmed he hadn't missed a shift. Timestamps and receipts backed it up. The evidence placed him in 2 places at once, an impossibility. For a brief moment the theory unraveled. Then a question surfaced. What if James wasn't the one who committed the murders? What if he had lived in the walls and helped someone else do it? The idea was chilling. James may not have killed his family with his own hands, but he had been close enough to hear them scream, close enough to witness every moment from behind the walls. And if he wasn't the killer, then who? Had he let inside? Detectives were now convinced that James Darby had orchestrated the murders from within the house, but new evidence suggested he hadn't acted alone. The idea that someone else had entered the home, carrying out the killings while James remained hidden, was both horrifying and plausible. Investigators began combing through James's phone records, emails, and internet activity. What they found painted a far more complex and disturbing picture than they had anticipated. In the months leading up to the murders, James had been in contact with a woman named Marla Voss. She was 46 years old, lived in a neighboring town, and had no obvious connection to the Darby family until detectives dug deeper. Marla had worked as a psychiatric nurse at the same juvenile facility where James had been treated as a teenager. Her file showed a brief employment period, ending shortly after an internal investigation into her inappropriate behavior with a patient. Though it was never proven, the timing suggested that the patient in question may have been James. Investigators tracked her down and brought her in for questioning. At first, she denied everything. But when shown the messages exchanged with James, many encrypted and laced with dark, violent fantasies, her composure cracked. In an interview that lasted nearly 10 hours, Marla admitted that she had reconnected with James after finding him through social media. Their messages quickly escalated from nostalgia to resentment. Marla claimed that James told her his family had abandoned him, that they pretended he never existed. He said they had locked him away and erased him from their lives. Marla, vulnerable and bitter about her own past, began to feed into his delusions. The truth was even more disturbing. Walter Darby had been involved in an earlier scandal in his 20s, long before his children were born. A young woman had accused him of assault. The charges were dropped, but the woman in question had a younger brother named Leo Marsh. Decades later, Leo had grown into a troubled man with a history of mental illness and erratic behavior. Records showed that he had been institutionalized several times and was currently living out of his car, just an hour away from Willard. Phone records and Marla's testimony revealed that James had found Leo through an online forum for forgotten victims. James reached out, posing as someone who also suffered injustice. He fed Leo a twisted narrative that Walter Darby was a monster, that the whole family deserved to pay. Over weeks, James manipulated Leo into believing he was carrying out justice, not murder. It was Leo Marsh who entered the Darby home, using a spare key James had retrieved and left in a hidden location. James, watching from the walls, listened to every scream, every footstep as Leo carried out the plan. Leo was arrested days later. He confessed in a long, rambling statement describing each murder in chilling detail. James was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life without parole. Leo was declared mentally unfit for trial and placed in a high-security psychiatric facility. In the end, it wasn't just the brutality of the crime that haunted detectives. It was how meticulously it had been planned, how coldly it had been executed, and how a forgotten son turned the walls of his childhood home into a front-row seat for revenge.